Why did this superpower crumble? Today we'll unravel the intricate reasons behind the dissolution of the Soviet Union, a once mighty superpower. Understanding its decline offers insights into Putin's motivations behind the Ukraine invasion. In 1917, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was created in the Russian Empire by Vladimir Lenin. With the momentum of the October Revolution that began with Lenin's arrival, the Soviet Union was established in 1922. Just 2 years later, its founder, Lenin, passed away. Thus began Stalin's era, during which he consolidated power, and the Soviet Union grew into an unprecedented force through World War II. In the 1970s, the Soviet Union was consistently one of the world's three superpowers. The strength of the Soviet Union didn't last. It began to waver during the crisis of the 1980s, and by 1991, it became a part of history. Thus, the United States' primary adversary vanished almost overnight. The dissolution of the Soviet Union shocked the world, and is often mentioned as one of the significant events of the 20th century. But how did the Soviet Union, once a superpower, fall? Understanding this, we can also infer why Putin invaded Ukraine. In this video, we will delve deeper into the reasons why the Soviet Union collapsed, both politically and economically. Let's dive in. The Soviet Union was the leading global producer of oil. As the top oil producer, its economy and decisions were significantly impacted by fluctuations in oil prices. There are two incidents that are absolutely essential when talking about oil-producing countries. They are the first and second oil shocks. Just as the first oil shock was behind the Soviet Union's unprecedented growth into a superpower in the 1970s, so too was the second oil shock behind the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1980s. To briefly explain the second oil shock, the Pahlavi dynasty collapsed in the Iranian Revolution of 1979. And Iran was reborn as an Islamic republic. At that time, Iran's leader, Khomeini, who was anti-American, restricted oil exports to keep the United States in check. Other Middle Eastern countries also reduced their oil production, and OPEC became a major influence in the international community. However, more attention should be paid to the events that followed the second oil crisis than to this event itself. The United States, impacted by the two oil shocks, decided to counteract by developing shale oil. In response, oil-producing countries, aiming to maintain their dominance, sought to undermine shale oil companies. This led OPEC to strategize, aiming to keep the United States dependent on traditional crude oil. So, unlike before, they will unite on a policy of lowering the price of oil. Since shale oil production is very expensive, there was no way to match the ever-declining price of crude oil. In this way, OPEC succeeded in taking down the United States shale oil companies. But the oil-producing countries faced a major economic crisis as the price of crude oil fell. The Soviet Union was not immune to this crisis. Like other oil-producing countries, its industrial structure was dependent on the export of raw materials. The collapse of oil prices came out of the blue. Around this period, the Soviet Union's economy began to falter. An essential part of a country's economic growth process is manufacturing. Of course, a country can grow without manufacturing, but then the national economy can easily be shaken by international conditions and small changes. The only major industries in the Soviet Union were the defense industry, the space industry, and raw materials. As many of you know, the defense and space industries require significant investment and often yield limited profits. The space industry received significant investment during the Cold War-era competition. While it might seem they didn't invest much in manufacturing, that wasn't the case. While the Soviet Union had a limited manufacturing sector, its products were of high quality. The problem was that under the communist system, production was limited to only what was deemed necessary for the people. Of course, if you limit production, supply will never catch up with demand. In fact, at the time the Soviet Union was on the path of collapse, it was difficult to obtain the necessities of life. There was no starvation or poverty among the people, but the pressure of not being able to obtain the goods one wanted caused great confusion. As a result, Soviet money lost value. This situation, one after another, took a fatal toll on the economies of the major powers. So people began to ask themselves one question: could it be that communism is flawed? While it may seem obvious today, such a question was deeply unsettling for the people of the Soviet Union at the time. It was Gorbachev, the last General Secretary of the Communist Party and the first President of the Soviet Union, who sparked this confusion. Gorbachev's arrival and the end of the Cold War were a significant figure, an event for the Soviet Union, symbolizing the polarization of the country. The people had been living in a society marked by repeated dictatorships and purges. Suddenly granting them freedom of speech had a more negative than positive effect. While liberals viewed Gorbachev's choice as the right one, socialists saw it as a catastrophic failure. Having previously controlled information, the Soviet Union was suddenly exposed to a vast array of ideologies. The suspicion that the Communist Party was really right, or that it was already a failed system, gradually became a fact as new opinions occurred one after another. In addition to this, even the constituent states of the Soviet Union began to become independent, one by one, which really drove it to the edge of a cliff. If there is one thing that those who are divided have in common, it is a sense of frustration. In a situation where the constituent countries, which had vaguely looked down on each other, were also moving away one by one, liberalism continued to develop with the end of the Cold War. The Soviet people, having been led to believe liberal states had collapsed, felt frustrated seeing the prosperity in these states. At this juncture, many began to question the very foundations of communism they had once believed in. So the Soviet Union was effectively standing at the end of its descent. And it was Gorbachev who put the finishing touches on the Soviet Union. After the end of the Cold War, the opinion that a vote would determine the fate of the Soviet Union became increasingly confusing in a situation where the truth about the world, previously hidden by the Soviet Union, was revealed. The public, frustrated by a collapsing economy, directed their anger at the regime. Gorbachev, in particular, was viewed as a political enemy by the conservative Soviet authorities. There are many types of incidents that occur when the powerful class becomes dissatisfied with the regime, but historically they ultimately lead to the overthrow of the regime. The incident that occurred in the Soviet Union was a coup d'etat. Coups that begin in the name of saving the unstable Soviet Union have rather the opposite result. Defenders of the coup in the Soviet Union could not be found at home or even abroad. The coup was a total failure, and all of its leaders fled abroad. Gorbachev was able to gather support from the public and proceed with the vote as planned. As is well known, the Soviet Union ceased to exist after 1991. We touched on this a bit at the beginning, but we will look briefly at how the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the invasion of Ukraine are related. The answer comes quickly when we consider what Putin wants. There are likely to be two things that Putin ultimately wants. That's because of what he says and does in the media. The first is to make his unstable regime solid again, and the second is to revive the Soviet Union. Or, to be more precise, he says, not to revive the Soviet Union, but to make Russia strong again, like the old Soviet Union. The first step in fulfilling Putin's ambitions is to break free from the cycle of humiliation. That was the defeat of the Cold War and the self-destruction of the Soviet Union. The most effective way to recover from this humiliation was to increase his influence over other countries. Ukraine is a bordering country, some of which had been built up through the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula, and above all, Ukraine was originally a vassal state of the Soviet Union. The invasion of Ukraine was the perfect way to accomplish what needed to be done first. However, the only result of starting a war with such grandiose dreams has been a prolonged war and a decline in Putin's approval rating. While I cannot claim to know Putin's exact intentions, my analysis is based on his public statements and action. What I've shared is based on inferences drawn from Putin's public statements and action. This concludes our exploration of why the Soviet Union A 20th century superpower disintegrated. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more insightful content. Take care and see you in the next video. Goodbye.